Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RealClear Politics Takeaway for Tuesday, August 31st. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP.
And I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief.
Mr. Cannon, the war in Afghanistan is officially over. The last U.S. troop left on a plane last night, but it was not, even though it was, again, we've talked about this before, a broadly supported policy. The way that it went down in the final weeks was pretty ugly and awful, including the death of 13 U.S. service members.
Right, and Joe Biden is going to address the country again. The president has, tried to show empathy for the people, Americans who are lost. He showed more in the last few days empathy for Afghans, but he's going to explain himself, and I don't think he has second thoughts. He hasn't exhibited any so far. He feels strongly that this was time for this to end, that it couldn't have been an open-ended commitment that lasted forever. Tom, as you pointed out, basically he's on the side of the majority of the American people on this.
I know, Carl, but that's not the issue, really. I mean, he keeps referring back to his decision to leave, and that's fine. That's not the problem. The problem is, why did we give up Bagram? Why did it end up being such a cluster toward the end that required us to be suddenly hunkered down, behind the perimeter at the Kabul airport, reliant on the Taliban to provide security for us and to help us get our troops out, our citizens out. It was a terrible way to end this thing. And you mentioned the empathy, Carl. That we had a couple stories, Washington Post today, and a couple others. There were some Gold Star fathers that were on Fox News last night talking about the ceremony at Dover Air Force Base, the returning caskets of those service members. Biden was caught looking at his watch, which made some people sort of cringe. And some of these meetings with the families apparently did not go well. And of course, the emotions are really raw. But Biden, from the reports, when he tried to empathize with these folks, kept mentioning his own son, Beau, who served, obviously, but didn't die in combat, died because of brain cancer. And they were a little bit put off by that as well, as if it was one of the family members called it shallow and scripted. It's a story that he's told repeatedly before, including just a few days ago when he was talking about Afghanistan. What do you make of that, Carl? It's a tough position for a commander-in-chief to be in, but it obviously didn't go well.
Well, it didn't go well with some of the families. I remember when President Trump called a woman whose husband was killed in Africa, active military, and he was trying to console her. He ended up getting in a fight with her. And I don't think it's an easy thing to do. I think the best thing a commander-in-chief can just do is say, tell me about your son or tell me about your husband, and be quiet and let people talk. And some people are going to vent. I don't look, he showed up there. He wasn't afraid of it. And I just don't think I don't think you can judge a policy by that. Those people are hurting, and they have a right to be hurting. And I think the president knows that.
So, Carl, while this is all going on, we've got there have been a bunch of stories about the multiple crises that the Biden administration is facing. Obviously, Afghanistan, and this story will continue as more Americans have been left behind and are going to have to find their way out. As the Secretary of State said, this turns from a military mission now to a diplomatic mission. So we'll be reading about those stories moving forward. We have a storm, Hurricane Ida, which is now a tropical storm, but inflicted an enormous amount of damage on the anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Meanwhile, we also have COVID, which is still a real issue in some parts of the country. We're now over 1,000 average daily deaths, and I think over 100,000 cases. So the Biden administration is continuing to struggle with that as well.
Oh, and you left out the California wildfires that are now threatening Lake Tahoe. I mean, it must seem at sometimes, if you're in that White House, biblical what's going on. Tom, let's take those two things though: the storm and Afghanistan. So you had 16 years of the day, another storm hit New Orleans, but it didn't flood New Orleans. The loss of life is going to be vastly lower than it was 16 years ago. Well, what happened? What happened was the government spent $14 billion bolstering those levees in around New Orleans. I wrote about this at the time. I covered that storm and wrote about the public policy. And a lot of people thought that money was folly. And so you hear, but New Orleans did not flood this time. So you sort of almost have the bookends, what government can do. It can hold back the tides, literally. You get the Army Corps of Engineers and they're working on the right project. They saved New Orleans. What government can't do. The American government apparently can't bring democracy to Afghanistan. So we've spent all that money there and lost all those lives. And it almost sort of shows you, what's possible and what isn't possible. And in terms of the last days of Afghanistan, it's been compared from, everything Saigon to Dunkirk. But look, surrender is never pretty. I went to Yorktown, Virginia this summer. I'd never actually been on the battlefield. And Lord Cornwallis had to surrender all those British and Hessian troops to George Washington. He hated it so much, he wouldn't even come out of his quarters. He sent an underling. He said he was ill. He was ill, all right. He was sick. He'd lost a war. And George Washington, of course, never wanted to take a slight like that innocently. Had his aid accept the sword of the British commander. But, we did not win in Afghanistan, and it was not going to be pretty any way we left. And I think that's what President Biden is hoping the American people come around to that point of view eventually.
Well, I personally do not. I think that is a convenient excuse for the administration to say that, this was going to be chaotic and terrible and awful.
You don't think an American president should invoke Cornwallis? Well, maybe you're right.
First of all, I do think if the Biden administration thought that it was going to be that, they should have told the American people that. They should have prepared them. Hey, this is not going to look great. There will be bumps in the road. Instead, Biden was basically promising this is not going to be like Saigon. This is not going to be bad. The Afghan army is going to hold up, et cetera, et cetera. It didn't go that way. And the American people weren't prepared to see what they saw. So that's number one. And number two, I don't buy the excuse. We'll never know. You can't prove a counterfactual, but we'll never know. But I personally don't buy the excuse that, this couldn't have been done better, differently, and in a less chaotic way than the way that it went down. And so I think that's a convenient excuse for the Biden administration to use. It may work, but it doesn't work with me.
Well, hindsight's always 20/20, and we have the benefit of hindsight on this show. This is our 200th podcast, by the way, for those of you listening. And I can honestly say I've enjoyed every one of them. And if you had Tom Bevan as your sidekick, you would too.
Thank you, Carl. We'll leave it there. I am Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RealClear Politics.
And I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief. This has been the RealClear Politics Takeaway for August 31st, 2021, a fateful day in American history.